Lynn, just like to say good morning and welcome, and thank you for joining us again for this session. This month we're going to be taking a look at working with in-house counsel. As usual, I've got the panel here with me. We're going to ask them some pre-prepared questions, and then there'll be a chance for you guys to put your questions to them towards the end. Please use the chat function or the Q&A box at the bottom if you have any questions. If you have any technical difficulties while the event is going on, my colleagues Stuart and Laura are in the chat, or you can get them at stuart@limeslade.com or laura@limeslade.com. Just drop them a message and they'll be able to help you with that as we go along. So without further ado, I'll start the session because try and get off on time this morning. Welcome to our speakers this morning. I'll just introduce those for you. First up, we've got Polly Fox. Polly is Principal Dispute Solicitor at Transport for London. In her role, she provides advice on a variety of commercial contracts, including construction and IT contracts. Polly manages disputes, runs adjudications in-house, and instructs external legal advisors and counsel. Next this morning, we have Catrin Rees. Catrin is Senior Legal Counsel at Wates Group. Catrin trained and qualified at Mayor Brown, specialising in construction and engineering law. After a few years working at other high-profile firms, including DHC Beechcroft, Floodgates and Collier Bristow, she moved to an in-house role in 2020. In addition to her legal career, she also sits on the National Committee for the National Association of Women in Construction. And finally, we have Nicholas Eldred. Nicholas is Director of NE Consulting Services, which he set up in 2016. There he provides consultant, general counsel and company secretary services to a number of different organisations. He also acts as mentor to a number of general counsel, heads of legal and company secretaries. So we're going to come to you first this morning, Polly, starting up with the very basics. But typically, what kind of support are you looking for as in-house counsel when you turn to external legal advice?
So mainly, and this is my personal view rather than the official view of TfL, but personally for me, I will only go to external advice if it's a very specialist point of law. So perhaps a construction issue would go to somebody at the bar and ask them to provide advice in writing. If we're going to go into an adjudication which looks as if it's going to be paper heavy, we just don't have the facilities to really organise that in-house. When I say paper heavy now, of course, it's all electronic disclosure. So we'd go to one of our panel law firms and typically we'll ask them to consider whether they'll do a fixed price or a cap or try and keep within some form of estimate. So we have to be quite organised before we ask them so that they can provide us with that sort of estimate or agree to a cap. So they're the circumstances in which we'd typically go out.
And is that similar for you, Catrin and Nicholas?
Yeah, I think it's probably exactly the same process that we would follow, and particularly over the caps, although that will stray into something that I've been asked to talk about. But I think I'd rather have a realistic budget that's stuck to than a sort of estimate that I'd like to hear then massively increases. Yeah. So yeah, I mean that reflects the process that we use external counsel or panel firms for.
And Nicholas, coming to you, a similar sort of question, but do you tend to use one law firm for everything, or do you use different firms for different specialisms? I mean, are there benefits to having one firm that you can always go to, have perhaps an agreement with, and get any, a large firm that's got all sorts of different advice within under one roof, or would you prefer to use a variety of firms?
First of all, good morning, everybody. I think, just answering for everybody rather than just me, I think it depends pretty much on what your legal needs are. If they're fairly straightforward, cover one aspect of law, are on repeat, tend not to evolve much, it may make sense to go to one firm for everything and do it and agree one overall rate, and to pick up Catrin's point, you know where you are money-wise. But for a lot of organisations, including some I've supported, legal needs can be quite complex, and you may need specialist advice in different areas. So what I've tended to find, looking back over the different organisations I've worked with, I have tended to seek specialists in different firms for particular issues. So I might go to one firm for employment, another for pensions, some for competition and state aid, others yet again for corporate and commercial work. And I tend to want to try and develop quite deep relationships with those individuals so that they understand the business and they give us advice in context, which is really important. And I've been known to go with individuals when they move firms rather than stay with the firm. So I tend to try and build strong relationships with individuals and individual groups rather than necessarily with particular law firms. Sometimes, if there's say, corporate and commercial work, if there is quite a lot of it around, I might have two law firms provide it. So there's an element of competition between the two. But seems to me for areas, specialist areas like competition law or state aid or employment, for me, it makes most sense to go to one firm, stick with them, develop the relationship, and make it work that way.
Thanks, Nicholas. Apologies if there's a little bit of background noise here. My window cleaner has decided to come right at this moment, but I'll mute myself while you guys are speaking. And that point on relationships is really useful, and that kind of brings us nicely into the next question, which I'm going to ask you, Catrin. What is it about relationships with solicitors that is a real positive? What is it when you think about the best relationships you have and what they do that impresses you?
I suppose closeness isn't the right word, and I think I'd probably try not to feel impressed by anyone now, because I think that can sort of tend to the wrong sort of relationship. I think it does happen in law quite a bit, where there'll be, some people's views are just not questioned because they are so impressive, or their stature is of a certain nature. But I would say, coming back to the question, it's your ability to be able to, I suppose, collaborate and cooperate with the person, and just thinking about the people that I work closely with. I think it's just as Nicholas said, you develop personal relationships with those that you work well with, and you come to rely on them and trust them. But I think that is also a two-way process. I would hope that the solicitors that I work with, week to week, let's say, or month to month, also feel that they can rely and trust me to give them the right information, or maybe steer an internal client the right way in dealing with them, and also to work fairly with each other. I think that I remember it from private practice, when you might feel that you were treated fairly unfairly. You get given things at the last minute, and last minute things of course happen, but I would hope that there is an element of reciprocity, but I would hope that there was an element of working together with each other on both sides. So I strayed away from the question a bit, but I think that probably doesn't best explain, but I've tried to explain the kind of relationships that I have tried to forge in-house, and hopefully I would hope that the solicitors that I work with regularly would say that was something that I'd achieved. So yeah.
Can I just add a comment? And
of course, yeah.
For me, when it works best, they are like virtual extensions of your in-house team. So you're almost just crossing over to them and saying, can you help on this particular issue? They understand the context, the background. They understand sometimes the internal politics and what the advice is trying to do, and they'll give you advice in context, and that can be really, really useful. So spending time working on those relationships with your external counsel, for me anyway, is not wasted time, because when you need them, the time you need them, they can really, really help you because you've invested that time in advance. So I'm not talking necessarily about just ordinary transactional legal advice, but sometimes there are issues where you need your external counsel to get it, understand it, and give you the advice that you are looking for effectively.
Absolutely, there's some good points there. And similarly, Nicholas, what
Yeah.
is it that that annoys you, that puts you off? What is it that solicitors do that perhaps make your life a little bit more difficult?
Right. Well, let me just say that I've encountered all these examples that I'm going to talk about, but they're now pretty rare. And I'm pleased they're pretty rare, but they still exist. I think the first one is advice I can't use. So people will give me legal advice that is accurate in a legal context, but when I receive it, I cannot deal with it because it hasn't taken into account the realities of the marketplace, it hasn't looked at the financial position, it hasn't looked at how we're going to communicate this, and the whole thing is just a nice little box with sort of a hard edge to it, which has legal advice in it, and it's not looking at the broader picture. And I work really, really hard with people to say, don't just give me the law, because effectively I can look that up in a book. What I'm looking for is some value-added advice. Yes, the law, but also broadly, where are we and where do we need to go? So advice I can't use. Advice that's designed to look good on the lawyer's file. Again, you know, there's sort of on the one hand, on the other hand type advice, and long memos with legal cases really doesn't do it. And happily, I'm getting less of that now than perhaps I used to. Because again, you go back and say, this isn't helping. We need some hard-edged commercial judgments, which I'm hoping you're going to try and share with me to move forward. Not understanding the business. Okay, lawyers are busy, but you've got to put some effort into understanding your client's business. So I remember when I was general counsel at BBC, some pitch for a major piece of work. I tend to ask the lawyers, what are you enjoying on the BBC at the moment? It's a very simple, straightforward question, which most people are really stumped by. They think, oh, crikey, it's a trick question. It wasn't. It's just, what are you enjoying on the BBC? One person rather airily said, I'm too busy for television, Nicholas. And they said, oh, but my thinking, oh, God, I've got to recover. My son's enjoying Doctor Who at the moment. So putting effort in and understanding the business. This has happened, all male pitches, when we're looking for work, you get a panel of 5 people, 3, 5, 7 people, and they're all blokes. I mean, this is simply not good enough. I haven't had it for a number of years, but I've certainly had it in the past. I asked one law firm, did they employ women? And they looked really, really, really embarrassed. And I think they were out of the room in 10 minutes. And then lastly, billing to the second. This really annoys me, where say a matter's gone quiet for a bit, and the lawyer chases you, say, is there anything happening, Nicholas, anything happening? And I say, no, nothing's happening. And then you get a sweep-up bill a couple of months later, which is broadly just made up of the lawyer chasing me to find out whether anything's happening. That doesn't happen that often, but when it does, it is really annoying.
Thanks, Nicholas. That brings us nicely to our next question, which you kind of touched on a little bit earlier, Catrin, about budgets and managing budgets, because obviously there is a difference between being a cost centre in-house and being a profit centre in a private practice. So what do you want to see when it comes to managing budgets, and what's the most effective way of working together?
I mean, I think I was very similar in private practice, and I've always hated fees and bills and billing. And I suppose I still do. So with that in mind, I think it's like no nasty surprises. I would just rather know up front, if this is going to be expensive, let me know. And I think that this sort of relates to the last thing that I've been asked to talk about, but that was almost a revelation to me moving in house. You know, I don't if it's going to cost £100,000, or you think we're in that ballpark, then please let me know, because then we can make a decision internally about whether this is worth it, or we can, you know, choose a plan B, which avoids, I would just hypothetically use that sum, but which avoids that expenditure. I think there is a tendency in private practice to almost pitch low, because you don't want your client to hear the high figures, and I would just rather know what the realistic sum is likely to be up front. And I think that is that's what I want to see when it comes to managing budgets, because we are often, I mean, depending on how the company's set up, but a conduit to the people who are making money. The people who are making money are the internal clients. So we still have to justify any additional expenditure to the people whose work actually contributes to the profit and to the payment of costs. So clarity and knowledge in advance, I think, is the most important thing to me, as opposed to, you know, unrealistically low budgets.
Yeah, Polly, would you like to add anything there?
Yeah, so I was in private practice for quite a few years doing the budgets. So what I look for, and even when we've got a fixed fee, is to try and ask the law firm to give us like a chart showing where they think they're going to incur the cost, so that at each time the client team behind us are aware that that's an opportunity to settle. So to just try and get them to really think about how they're structuring their costs and at what point they think that costs are going to go up. And you know, in the courts now, the new cost schedules, I think, have really helped firms and clients get a handle on how to keep the costs down and be aware of what's going on and when they might suddenly peak, and where is an opportunity to try and have a mediation or think about how else to resolve a matter.
And also, oh, sorry, just
no, go on.
Sort of related to that, I'm thinking about things like adjudications, where each party is going to bear their own costs. There is an element that there's a tipping point where any client is going to start paying to be involved in the adjudication, in effect. And I think that it is important to bear in mind that you might win something but end up paying for the privilege of that nice feeling of getting the decision in where you've won. And that is something that I like to bear in mind. I bang on about too internally, and I'm not suggesting that law firms don't do it, but there is a tendency that you can get swept up in the, you know, the drama or the excitement of disputes, and forget that there should be an end goal, and that end goal is to resolve it, you know, without paying out too much money, or to recover what you've lost, not to pay to be involved in something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So one of the core themes there with the budget was communication, and I think that's something that goes across this industry and probably all industries when it comes to having successful outcomes, successful projects. Polly, what do you want when it comes to communication from your external legal teams?
Well, so a few different themes. So picking up on one of the comments that Nicholas said, which he said he hasn't come across recently, advice that's not tailored to meet the client's needs. I find that really frustrating. If you're going to an external firm, you want something you can't do. I can go through a contract and summarize it. I don't need to pay someone else to do that. I'm not too busy to do that myself. So if I go to a client who's been acting on a matter for a while, I'd expect them to add value. And it drives me nuts when the advice is just simply a recital of the contract terms. I mean, you know, a law student can do that for me. I don't need it. I want it in context. And then just other silly things as well, as like presentation of the advice. I don't want it in 10 font that nobody can really read without a magnifying glass. I don't want it in tiny little paragraphs across the page. I want it in a straightforward A4 format, and I want to be able to easily summarize it myself. I don't want to have to spend 4 hours trying to untangle a 6-page advice, which I might as well have just done the advice myself. So I think, and I can see somebody in the comments has said it, I think some lawyers do still have a way to go to understand how to break something down. And when I was at Herbert Smith, I worked for a property developer, and the board of directors were just absolutely insistent that no letter could be more than a page. They were just like, we're not going to turn it over, Polly, so get it onto a page. And it really focuses your mind of like, well, what do I need to actually tell them is happening, why it's happening, and what their options are. And I haven't got that strict with my own, you know, external legal advisors, but that's where I'm coming from. I expect to have clear English, clear points, and then communication on cost, like Catrin said. You know, that's another thing. tell me the bad news early. Don't wait for the billing. And one advantage we have at TfL is we've got 13 accounting periods in a year rather than 12, and we have to bill monthly. And I think that helps because it means that law firms every month have to issue us a bill. And the way we do things isn't necessarily the way law firms do things. And I find it quite amazing, given that, you know, we're the clients, that they don't just adjust to what we want. Because I did when I was in private practice. I just, whatever they wanted, we did, even if it didn't suit our accounting system. So I've been quite surprised at how reluctant some firms are to change their own internal procedures to match ours when we're paying the bill. So I think communication is really important. There's lots of different levels. It's not just like the advice, obviously. It's what Catrin and Nicholas both said earlier. It's building that rapport. And we've got panel firms, so we do try and use different firms regularly. But inevitably, you form relationships with some barristers and some partners at law firms that you really like, and you do have a tendency to keep wanting to go back to them. But you have to keep trying to make sure that you use panel firms across the board and different barristers, because your favourite barrister might not be available when you really need advice.
Can I just make an additional point on the how to write the advice issue? Because I completely agree with all the negatives, but when you get that specialist who knows you well and knows the purpose and knows what you're trying to do, and you have a word, they can couch advice. So the strongest arguments are encapsulated in the first 2 paragraphs of an email. And there may be more, but the first 2 paragraphs, knowing that when I get it, I'm going to send it to other members of the management team saying, read this, knowing that they won't get beyond the end of the second paragraph, and they've either got it by then or they disagree. So normally you get the advice, it comes in, your management team colleagues read it and so go back and say, okay, fine, Nicholas, go with it. And they haven't done the pages, they haven't done the appendices, they haven't done the schedules, they haven't done any of that. They've read effectively the summary at the front, they bought it, they get it, they say, okay, Nicholas, off you go, deal with it. And packaging the advice in that way, however complicated it might be, in the first couple of paragraphs often works really well.
That's some good advice there, good practical tips for the solicitors listening. And then continuing with you, Nicholas, on top of obviously answering the questions you asked them and giving the advice that you've asked for, are there any other ways that solicitors in private practice or those at chambers or even consultants, whatever, can be useful to your teams? What is it outside the day job that makes you?
Yeah, I think there are a number of things actually. The first is, if you've cultivated and developed trusted relationships with 1 or 2 people, you can call upon them in times of need. Things that you want to talk about or bounce off somebody, but you cannot talk internally to anybody. There's a very good partner at the end of the line you can talk to for quiet and sensible advice. So I've done that on a number of occasions with trusted individuals who I know well. I trust their judgment. Can I just bounce X, Y, and Z off of you? So they can be really good sounding boards. You can use them also to help deliver tough messages. So I'm trying to get something through an organization that we all know needs to happen, but actually there are people within the organization resisting for often, sometimes good reasons, but often because they don't want change. Having a law firm write in on my instructions to back up what we're looking to do. So it's not just the law of Nicholas Eldred, it's ex-law firm saying this is the right way and this is the law and so on and so forth is a really good thing. So you can help them to deliver tough messages. Sometimes you can use their letterhead in a dispute. So you might go for a particular law firm whose letterhead will help you in a dispute with a third party or supplier or someone else. So I remember in New York when I was working for an organization, working for Christie's, one of the my senior colleagues said, New York will often fight cases depending on who the law firm is on the other side. Now, whether that's right or not, that was just his view. I still think there is something on sometimes getting the right letterhead for the right type of issue. You can pick up Jen as well. So, you know, the fact you go to specialists means they're acting for lots and lots of people in that sector. And without any crossing any lines at all, they will sort of, you kind of pick up that, you know, such and such is moving in the market in a particular way. And that's just useful information to have. And I say nothing confidential at all, but it's just, you can kind of get a sense of how the market's moving. And then lastly, training. They provide for themselves huge amounts of training internally for CPD and all that sort of stuff. I've quite often gained access to their internal training seminars, so members of my team have gone there. And for big issues, we've got lawyers come to train members of my team. So, you know, you might get people turning up on a developing area of law and you get a teach-in. And although we're talking about largely solicitors here, we have members of the bar who would come in and talk to us about developing areas in privacy and data and protection and so on and so forth. So use them that way. They often like it because it's a way for them to develop stronger relationships with clients. And it also gives them visibility of individuals, you know, with the in-house team. But of course, it works for the in-house team as well, because you pick up the latest understanding on developing areas of law.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nicholas. That's really helpful. Before I ask our final question this morning, we will have a little bit of time for questions. So if you do have any questions for the panel, please stick them in the chat box now. And we'll try and get those to people. I see we've got a couple in the Q&A section already. Catrin, coming to you finally, as I think it's fair to say you've moved most recently into an in-house role of our panel. What was the biggest shock you had when you moved from private practice?
This is a really easy question for me to answer, but it's quite personal. So, I mean, to me, in that I think I moved to Wates maybe 3 or 4 weeks before lockdown was announced. So I will never really be able to untangle what was a shock of working in house versus what was a shock of the world just changing overnight. So that was the biggest shock. How I worked, I went from going into the city every day to working from home like we all did every day, and meeting most of certainly my internal clients over Teams and Zoom over a year, and forging relationships virtually. So, but I mean, that I wouldn't have been unusual. That's not unusual to an in-house role. So I suppose maybe one of it was not a shock, but the differences in experience was maybe I don't know if this is related to into company philosophies, but the sort of informality of the advice that was given. So I'm available for people to call all the time. Used to having meeting organized and having your notes for the meeting and maybe circulating something before. At the way, the pace, and that might have been related to the pandemic as well, especially at the start, required to work at, it just was a very different pace of giving advice. So that was a difference. I wouldn't say it was a shock, but it's a different way of working in-house. But I suppose one of the nicer surprises was I find it a more collegiate relationship between your internal client and the lawyer. I feel, well, I am their colleague and I'm treated like a colleague, rather than the legal advisor, who is always external to the issues arising. That can have its downsides, but I think it has its benefits as well, and that's something that I really enjoyed coming to the role, especially during such a strange crisis, basically.
Thanks. We've got a couple of questions. I can see Nicholas is typing an answer to this one, so perhaps I'll throw this one at you first, Nicholas. Do the panel have a single piece of advice for people putting together a pitch or proposal to work with in-house teams?
Well, I'm going to stop typing now. I think if you just wanted a single piece of advice, I would say demonstrate value for money.
Mhm.
I mean, the expertise should be assumed, although law firms do need to demonstrate that, but value for money is really important, because you're going to have to take this in-house and say, well, look, it's going to cost 30, 40, 10,000 pounds or whatever it is, but it is good value for money. So that would be my suggestion.
Catrin?
So can you just repeat the question? The question was
a single piece of advice for people putting together a pitch or proposal to work with your in-house team.
I think, as not to repeat a previous answer, so do look at who you're going to be pitching to. So much information available in the on the internet, LinkedIn probably being the main source, but also article. There's so much that's available that show where people's background is, what their interests might be, how they might respond to you, and present yourself in that way. And if to an extent that's possible, maybe look to see what the business might be needing, where there might be any gaps in what they're currently receiving from their current providers. I mean, that's not so easy, but obviously if you know someone who's working in-house, maybe have a coffee first and then sort of gently ask the question, is there anything else that you feel like that could be provided for you that you're not getting already?
I think something that sometimes is forgotten is the associates will do the bulk of the work, and firms very rarely bring the associates along. And I think sometimes more thought should be given to that, because that's who you're going to interface with, and it's important to develop a relationship with the associate and have confidence in the associates as well.
And actually, that's such a good point, because one of the firms that I work very closely with personally, maybe as opposed to the rest of the team, I have a very, very, very good relationship with the associate. So that, I agree with that point.
Our next question is about receiving advice that is not tailored, and could we share some examples? I mean, there's one in the chat box there from Jason Smalley who says his worst example was someone who just cut and paste from practical law, so the advice wasn't tailored. Polly, could you share, I suppose, maybe not with the details, but what would you expect in advice that is tailored to you and your needs?
Well, actually, I'd probably say most of the best advice I've received over the last few years is from the bar. I find the barristers, I use mainly Atkin chambers at the moment. They seem to, even like the really junior ones, write, it's not informal, but they write in a very approachable way. And it's like they pick up your instructions, which I'll try and do it as a narrative in chronological order. So they just then go to the next level, and they go, I suppose it's like Nicholas's point, you start with, this is what it appears to be. You've asked us to advise in writing, this is what we think. And I suppose as well, if you work with the same people again and again, and you get really cross the first time you get something, you say, look, what is this? not that I talk like that, but I'm not happy with this. You want me to pay you X thousand for it? Come on. I mean, I could have done this myself. It's really hard to have that conversation. And I think that's the hardest bit, is how do you give feedback back on why you're not happy with an advice? And I think it is trying to explain to them, put the executive summary at the front. Remember, I'm a lawyer too. I've come to you to add value. And just trying to find a way to help them think about what they're doing it and why they're doing it. Because I think what happens is, when you're a lawyer, you sit down and you go through all the facts and you go through the contract, and it can take pages. It's like your head is working through it. You can't present that to your internal client. You just can't do it. They don't want it. They only want like that bullet summary at the front. They won't go beyond that. So it takes a lot more extra effort. And I guess that's the message that you need to get over to your external legal advisors, because they're great at drafting letters. But just recently I got an advice which I was just shocked by, because it literally was just a recitation of the clauses of the contract. And worst of all, given that we'd been working with them for 2 years, kept saying, and if you want more advice on this aspect, come to us. It's like, well, hang on a second, you've been advising us for 2 years. I wanted that now. You know the facts, you know the background. Why isn't that in your advice? And then just simple things. It's like, I mean, surely you should all know now how to make something user-friendly, and putting it in a fancy font and a fancy layout on a page is not actually user-friendly. It might look pretty, but it's not marketing material. It's something that somebody's going to use, and they need to be able to read it easily.
It seems that ultimately these communication issues are the same across whatever we're trying to get across to our clients. Catrin, Nicholas, would either of you like to add anything to that final question?
I suppose it's the communication piece again. Just thinking about what Polly said, maybe more time is needed to provide that advice, or you need to add a caveat that this is now not complete because I need to go to my colleague who knows all about this, or just say it. Don't pretend the advice is ready when it's not. If you need another day, phone and say, it's going to take another day because I have to check XYZ with this person who of course knows all about it because we were working so closely with you for 2 years. It's the communication, but I think I feel there's a certain urgency in private practice of getting it out, pleasing the client. Can't possibly change this deadline. Maybe you can, but maybe you can't. But maybe you can. There is every possibility that you can phone up and say, actually, I just need to check XYZ, and it's the point of communication rather than just assumption.
And Nicholas, finally coming to you, anything you'd like to add?
I just want to pick up a slightly different tack, which is don't impose punishing deadlines on external counsel to get advice over.
Yeah.
Sometimes colleagues say, we need this advice by Friday. And actually, they need it by week Friday. They just think the lawyers will be somehow slow and not deliver if you say a week on Friday. But if you give your external lawyers a proper deadline and plenty of time to think, plenty of time to share draft thoughts with you, but in the knowledge that they absolutely will hit that second Friday deadline, not the first one, so they will deliver for you on time, then you will get better, more thought out, more considered advice than something that's knocked out quickly just to get something out to the client on some sort of artificial deadline. So as instructing the lawyers, I think we have real responsibilities in how we engage with our external colleagues. And one of them is just not imposing really ridiculous deadlines, and sometimes pushing back internally and saying, come on, you do not need that by then. And if you want a first draft by 8 a.m. tomorrow, it's literally going to be the precedent that's run off the standard by some junior lawyers had to work till midnight, and it hasn't been looked at terribly carefully, and it hasn't been considered. Really, let's just push back, give them the week to do it, and you'll get something so much better.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So that's it. We're out of time this morning. Thank you so much to Nicholas, Polly and Catrin for joining us. It's been a really useful session. Thank you to everyone who joined us watching, and those of you in the chat sharing your experiences as well. As always, the video will be up on YouTube in a couple of days along with an article. Subscribe to the channel if you want to get notified of when that goes live, but of course if you're on our database you'll probably get an email at some point. We probably won't have another session in May, but I think our next one will probably be in June, so again keep an eye on your inboxes because we'll let you know as that is coming up. As always, if you ever need any further help and advice, or want us to put you in touch with our speakers, or have any ideas for what we might want to cover in the next session, do let us know at the usual details. So that's it from us this morning. Thank you, Polly, Catrin and Nicholas, and
thank you so much.
see you all next time.
Bye.
Thank you.